I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe Podcast. Today I'm speaking with Ed Finn, author of What Algorithms Want, Imagination in the Age of Computing. Anyone who's interested in seeing Ed's 5 book recommendations, please be sure to check out the site during or after this podcast. It's tinapp2ps.org. Ed, thank you for being on the podcast today. I'm curious to begin, was there an algorithm or a computer program that you were thinking about that inspired this book, that got you thinking about studying it and pursuing it further? Or was it more of a general idea that came about maybe in a more circuitous way?
Well, there were a few different motivations for me, but there were definitely a few algorithms that I noticed that piqued my interest. One of them is Google and all of the many faces and facets of Google. And I think almost all of us use Google in some way or another. It's very difficult to escape using Google. And so one of the algorithms that I noticed was the autocomplete system. So when you're typing something into the search bar, it pops up with little suggestions for what Google thinks you might be searching for. And it's very useful. And you see people using it for all sorts of interesting things. Like it's become a kind of informal spell checker when you're trying to figure out what somebody's name is, or even if you don't even quite remember the name of something, you can type in some words and sometimes autocomplete will figure out what you mean. But when you start to think about it, autocomplete is really quite interesting because it first of all, it tailors those responses to you based on your history and things that Google knows about you and also your geography. And so it's very interesting to think about just at that very near instantaneous moment of reaction that the machine already is shaping its responses to you. But then it's also interesting to think about the way that autocomplete comes about, which is that thousands and thousands of other people have typed in these same search queries. And so you're getting this weird moment of communality with lots of other people who had the same question. Before I started writing the book, I'd done this exercise with my students. I still do it in some of my classes, where I have them write a constrained piece of poetry or fiction using a prompt from autocomplete. So the only things that they can put into their piece of work are words and phrases that they've copied out of autocomplete, out of the results that the machine has given back to them. So if you start with a prompt like, why do I, or how should I, and then you can add on letters or other words to get more options. It's really interesting to see what the machine comes back with, and sometimes really profound questions like why should I live, how do I love. So it's this fascinating glimpse into the id of the collective cultural consciousness. So that was one of the algorithms that led me down the path of writing this book.
I was wondering, actually, I thought about a test or something that I've seen that I thought maybe you were going to mention before you mentioned the poetry thing, which is the autocomplete that starts often with women should, or why do black, and then let it fill in itself. I've had debates with people about those. You know what I'm talking about, right? Where basically you'll get sort of racist things that pop up because it seems to be popular, or homophobic or misogynist things in these algorithms. Now, I've heard from some people that, this reflects the sort of id of our society, the thing that we don't want to talk about, but many people are apparently searching. And I've also heard from people that, well, actually, it doesn't prove anything in terms of that's how people feel. What it actually proves is that people are searching this potentially to find out like why these stereotypes exist or why these concerns exist in society. It doesn't mean that they believe it. Now that you've started with autocomplete, I'm just curious if you could weigh in on how you feel autocomplete reflects society in certain ways.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of horrifying things lurking in the autocomplete fields. And I guess I don't know, it's very difficult to say how genuine or sincere or real the sentiments expressed in search queries are, right? And maybe a way to answer your question, the way I think about the search bar is as a kind of confessional. People used to confess to their priests or to some sort of trusted figure, and now people spill out their secrets to the search bar, to the machine. And I started to think about this way because I think it was in the 90s, actually, there was this really remarkable early moment of data privacy anxiety when AOL released a bunch of user data that they thought they had anonymized, but it turns out they hadn't anonymized it very well.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this one user, I think the name was user 927, which was the sort of anonymized number that was given to this person. But their search results were just really weird and horrifying and fascinating. There was at least one stage adaptation made out of this sort of persona of this, and there was all sorts of horrible. It's been a while since I looked at this, but as I recall, there was a lot of racism and misogyny in there. But it was also clearly someone who was sort of had psychological issues and was talking to their machine or asking their machine questions that what we would term a rational person would know that the machine wasn't going to answer. And that sort of prompted me to think of the ways in which all of us depend on the machine and ask questions that we would never really expect the machine to be able to answer. We ask Google all sorts of things that Google doesn't know. And that may be you could argue, unknowable. But there's something really interesting there, that asking the question is not the same thing as avowing that sentiment. But I think the id is a really good kind of cultural frame for thinking about that, because that's what we do. And especially when you think about things that people do online, engaging in hate speech or, just being rude to a random stranger on a Reddit forum, mm-hmm. or searching for pornography or whatever, people are performing behaviors, and sometimes they're performing these behaviors that are forbidden or taboo in other ways. And, it feels depersonalized, it feels distanced, it feels somewhat safer to do it online, even though in some ways it's like the worst place you could do any of that because it's so easy to track so much of our activity online.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we can stick to the autocomplete as an example, but feel free to mention anything else you like. I'm curious, if you were to study any kind of algorithm, and you mentioned a number of them in the book, of course, what about when you come up with the issue that the algorithms themselves, like Google's, for example, it's proprietary and it's in some sense out there for us to read about and understand through playing with it maybe, but there's a lot of the coding that, well, on one level is basically hidden from us by patent or copyright and by people who don't want others to take on their algorithms, but also by machine learning that, as you mentioned in the book, even the coders, to some extent, the programmers don't necessarily know how everything is working. How do you, as a scholar, start to unpack algorithms, be it autocomplete or anything else, when you don't have full access to it?
Well, the way I approach this, first of all, is by looking at the gap between the things that we think algorithms do and the things that they actually do. And that gap is tremendously important. And as I argue in the book, the algorithm ends up being this kind of pack mule moving information and ideas and rules and applications from the perfect mathematical modeled world of computation, the space where procedural language is the rule and everything is countable and everything is knowable, everything is contained within a self-consistent system of set of programming languages and operating systems and structures. Between that world of mathematical perfection, or at least predictability, computability, and the real world, which is messy and incomplete and continuous, not discrete, and constantly surprising us and full of so much more information than we know what to do with or can capture in any way. That gap, the implementation gap, is one of the places that I start in the book. And I think it's a valuable lesson for everybody involved in computational culture, whether that's a programmer or an entrepreneur, an architect trying to create some new computational system, or a scholar, a researcher, a student, or just an everyday citizen consumer of digital goods who's using one of these systems. There's always a trade-off between the perfect model, the perfect world that you wish existed, that you write up in code, and the real world, where things fall short and things overshoot, and there are lots of surprises. And so, that space of computation is really useful for us to think about because we idealize it. We really want it to be true. We bend over backwards to make our computational systems more accurate, more correct than they really are. We use a special voice when we're talking to the airline reservation computer to try and make it, more effective at its job. And that feeds into much deeper conceptions of magic and belief. We want to invest these systems with more power than maybe they have in the real world. We really want them to work. We really want the magic to work. And so the reason that I see this happening beyond just the last, say, 60 years of computational history, computational time, is that we've always lived with this idea of abstraction. It's one of our most powerful conceptual tools, that we're going to take something complicated with lots of context, something very individual and specific from the real world, and we're going to pull away some little piece of it. We're going to abstract it away and make a generalization. We're going to use this structure, this tower of generalizations to, build a structure of knowledge about the world. Computation is really built on that notion of abstraction, taking the real world and abstracting it to some simple model. And it's very seductive. And so I talk about this in the book as the seductive nature of computation, that we really want these things to be true. We want these abstractions to be true because they're beautiful and they're simple. But every abstraction has a residue. It has a remainder. It has some bit of context and detail that gets left behind. And that can really come back to bite you if you're not careful about it. So that's sort of the starting point for me. And I think that's really useful when you think about the notion of the black box. I think that's what feeds a lot of our sort of collective endorsement of, collective obsession with the black box and other terms like that, where we say, oh, well, we've captured this little piece of magic in this machine, and it doesn't matter if we don't know exactly how it works, because look, it works.
Yeah, and I loved what you wrote about throughout the book, kind of in terms of these gaps. It's exactly as you said, right? There are these two levels at least which never quite meet. If you were going to, I guess, maybe help out a scholar who is trying to do this kind of work, if you can envision giving some guidance in terms of the method that you used or that you found helpful, maybe you did multiple ones and found some had more strengths or more weaknesses. Once you identify this gap between what the ideal algorithm does and what the actual consequences are, or what it actually produces, how would you suggest a scholar start to build on that to make either an article or a book or whatever kind of scholarship they may be interested in? What do you do once you've identified this gap?
I would say follow the seams. Look for the seams, points of tension, the ruptures between the rhetoric and reality, or the model and the actual implemented real thing. Follow those seams and start to think through their consequences and think about why those seams exist in the first place and what they tell you about what's going on underneath the hood. That becomes a way of performing what I call algorithmic literacy in the book. And I mean that just as adapting this metaphor or this set of methods and sort of a critical framework from the humanities and applying it to computational culture. There are very sort of straightforward questions that you can start to ask once you start to reflect on these gaps. And one of the simple ones is, what's missing? What's been abstracted away? What's been hidden? When you look at a menu of options presented to you by, say, Facebook as a user on Facebook, what's not on the menu? What's been hidden away so that you're not thinking about it and not worried about it? And that can be one very powerful way to start to perform your own scholarship, to write and think about these systems. And then as a corollary to that, think about what's been simplified here, right? What exists, but in a simplified form. And I think a lot of the most powerful computational tools we use today take something very complex and turn it into a single button that you can press. Uber is a button you can press to summon a vehicle wherever you are. Google is a button you can press to answer any question. And there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure and money and power and people and activity, different kinds of things that go into making those systems work. And they can be very powerful, and they can at times be really emancipatory and good, but not always. And they create many problems as well. But there's a romance to being able to push that one button and have this amazing thing happen. And so thinking about the ways in which these systems can funnel or simplify the world and what the larger consequences of that are, that's another good starting point. I talk about companies like Amazon that have made it incredibly easy to shop for things and have them appear magically on your doorstep a couple of days or sometimes even a few hours after you push the button. Mm-hmm. And, there's a tremendous infrastructure that goes into that with lots of contract workers in really unpleasant, sometimes really awful conditions at warehouses being tracked by the step and by the second. And so their productivity who are supposed to be getting this stuff to you. I think of those systems as being sort of funnels sucking away the complexity and the messiness of the real world. But then it doesn't just disappear, right? It gets dumped onto those people working in those warehouses, many others, the drivers, many other people in these really difficult jobs who are sort of taking on all of the complexity and the messiness so that it gets sucked out of your life as the consumer.
Mm-hmm. When people talk about algorithms these days, because it seems to come up a lot and it seems to come up in many different ways, do you find that there's certain ideas floating around or certain concepts about algorithms that are either faulty or that are really problematic that you've come across since you've been studying this and since you've been putting it into a historical context that, can span thousands of years, really, if you think about it? What ideas or concepts would you like to maybe clarify for people who have expressed these maybe concerns or doubts? Is there any common idea about algorithms that you identified in your research as you were working on this?
Well, the reason I started writing the book, or one of the other reasons, is that the word algorithm itself is a really shallow word, or deceptively shallow word, the way a lot of people use it. Mm-hmm. If you look at the way that engineers and computer scientists tend to use it, it's basically as a method for solving a problem. That's the way that it was described in my early computer science classes, which is a very pragmatic but also facile definition that can mean almost anything. And as people use the word in larger cultural context, algorithm, it sort of shrinks to fit, right? So people will use it in 1 minute as this really grandiose, oracular thing like Google's algorithm, by which they maybe mean, all of the thousands of different services that Google performs for individuals, for businesses. So it becomes a really amorphous term. But then in the next second, they'll be using it to refer to a few lines of code in a very small, sector of the computational universe. Sometimes I think that's a deliberate shell game that people engage in to try and deflect attention away from the larger stakes of some of these conversations. That's one thing that I tried to change in writing the book, and I hope to continue working on and having conversations like this one, that the word algorithm is more than just a method for solving a problem. And it comes with politics. It comes with a lot of historical context and baggage, and it taps into very deep roots in our cultural consciousness. And when we think about the power of language and symbolic logic, we think about the role of magic and faith in society. And when we think about the way in which our engagement with computational culture now starts to feel more and more like religious belief and less like reasoned engagement. And the algorithm ends up being a kind of avatar for all of those different relationships. And so I think it's important to understand the deeper roots of the word. Mm-hmm. And then I think that fundamental lack of context or unwillingness to look at the deeper history of the word ends up informing shallow deployments of the word in cultural life. And that's what I think can lead to a lot of problems, especially when people create systems and think of them essentially as they very neatly identified some problem and they're going to solve it with some computational system. But problems in the real world are not neatly cut out and separated away from the rest of the world, right? Everything is connected. And so I think a lot of the challenges we're going to have with computational systems in the next few years is around those second order effects where you thought you were solving some specific issue, but it turns out that you are impacting all of these other things, and that you didn't really solve the first issue in the first place, but now you've also created these other problems. And I think that computation can help, but it's not a panacea, and it's not something. I'm hoping that maybe this is starting to change, but in the past 20 years, especially the people who are wielding the powers of computation are usually not being very reflective about the social consequences of those powers.
I liked a lot what you wrote at the end about the role of humanities and that kind of scholarship and how it can potentially combine or at least use computing as not necessarily an enemy or something to be challenged, but something to be thought through in various ways. Could you say maybe a little bit about how you envision some of the better scholarship happening in relation, not necessarily just to algorithms, but the way you see humanities playing a role in this?
Yeah, I think we have to start by recognizing that the fundamental things that we do, things like reading and writing, what it means to be human, what we mean by the word culture, all of these things are changing in the face of computation in very profound ways. From something as simple as the fact that even if you are a medievalist, you're almost certainly using all kinds of different computational systems like Google to conduct your research, to be a scholar. You might think that it's no different from pen and paper, but it really is. So the politics of computation infuse all of our work as researchers, as scholars, as humanists. And so I think it's ridiculous to pretend otherwise, or to pretend that what we mean by reading today is the same thing as a researcher might have meant by reading in the 1950s or the 1970s or even the 1990s. So that's a place to begin, is to recognize that the definitions are not fixed. And of course, many scholars have recognized that over time, that the notion of reading has changed continuously throughout history, and we have to be attentive to those changes. I think to conduct really great scholarship today, we have to be cognizant of the intertwining of computation and culture. And that doesn't mean ignoring one or the other. It's not about doing more technical histories of operating systems or platforms, though those can be really rich. And it's not about just writing about literature and pretending that the computation is not changing the world. It's about finding ways in which the two come together, either in interesting new collaborations and new art forms, or in conflict and tension. And I think in both of those cases, the humanities are really vital to engaging, to helping us to understand and to helping us define ourselves in the space of this rapidly changing cultural landscape. The critical skills that we teach, the ways in which we engage in closed readings, we deal with ambiguity, we deal with complexity. These are all really vital skills. We need to be empowering our students and thinking of their humanities work as not some kind of elective or luxury good, but as actually fundamental, intrinsically important part of what it means to be an educated and engaged human being today. We need to articulate the vital importance and role of the humanities in that light. And you can actually see Google did a big study, I think a couple of years ago, to try and assess what the most important factors were to success within their company. And they were expecting it to be things like STEM literacy. And all of the most important factors basically were sort of humanities-centric skills, the so-called soft skills like collaboration, communication, able to engage effectively with others. I think that we need to pay attention to that. Those in the humanities have known these things for a long time, but we need to find ways to share that message and engage constructively with people who might not have thought about literature classes in that way before, and not approach it from a defensive posture, but to engage. I say engage these transformations with open arms wholeheartedly to try and figure out, because it's desperately important that we figure out how our world is changing and how we can live enriching, thoughtful lives and build a better world through technology and through positive social change.
Well, it makes me think a little bit about, my education is in Canada and now I'm in the United States. And so I've seen at least two countries in the way that they fund research. In the book, you talk about how some journalists or some publications were worried more about how their story would fit into an algorithm. So they were gaming the algorithm as opposed to really worrying about the content. Also with stock market trades, they were in some cases worrying more about how to game the algorithm than to think about what even were these commodities that were being traded. it made me think a little bit about how at some point, at least when I was completing my graduate work, you had to put in digital humanities basically into any funding package. It was totally humanities people who usually don't get very much money anyway, gaming this system in a sense because they knew that, like, okay, if I say that this is digital humanities, I may get more of an opportunity for a grant, whereas if I say it's regular humanities or something, that doesn't look good. I mean, at least among my group of friends or whatever, we kind of rolled our eyes as soon as we heard digital humanities, not because the people that were doing that kind of work were bad in any way, but because it became a term that effectively meant nothing and began to be used for funding purposes and effectively to put yourself into a certain category that was more likely to earn potentially funding or something like that. How do we stop ourselves from falling into that trap that many journalism fields have fallen into and many others?
Well, I think it's really challenging, and the plight of funding in the humanities is really dire in a lot of places. And so I certainly sympathize with people who are reaching for anything that they think might help. I think, as in so many things in the humanities, my fundamental position is that the game is rigged. And if you want to win, you need to move the goalposts and really redefine the entire context in which you're playing the game. When you look at the funding levels of the National Endowment for the Humanities and compared to the sciences or the National Science Foundation, for example, or the National Institutes of Health, there are orders of magnitude difference between those agencies. And then, of course, also an order of magnitude difference between the NEH and the National Endowment for the Arts, which is even more impoverished. Mm-hmm. So, it's a bad game to be playing in the first place. And I've been lucky enough to be at a university which really is interdisciplinary and taking a lot of interesting creative risks here at Arizona State University. And so I've been encouraged and had the good fortune to find colleagues across many different disciplines to collaborate on grants. And so I'm running projects funded by the National Science Foundation, by NASA, by the Sloan Foundation. We're working on a new proposal to NIH. While that might seem outlandish to traditional humanities scholars, I really encourage everybody to find ways to work together, to explore ideas at the intersection of humanities and different fields, whether they're STEM fields or the social sciences or other parts of the university. I think that it makes for much stronger proposals on a very pragmatic level. It doesn't have to be just chasing the latest buzzword. But it might also, I think it does, lead to better ideas and better work. You just have more productive conversations. You ask one another really challenging, open-ended questions that you're not used to fielding because they're coming out. They might come from a very different fundamental perspective and cause you to question some of your assumptions in a good way. And if you can find ways to work together across disciplinary boundaries, I think that can be really exciting. And it can also lead to work that's more broadly impactful in the public. So I'd say the difference between the challenges that you saw amongst humanities researchers chasing money by, sticking a digital humanities label on their research, and the challenges that, say, Gawker Media faced when Nick Denton wrote his essay that we became slaves to the Facebook algorithm, where they were trying to craft their posts to attract more attention from the filters on social media. The difference between those two is that, for the most part, in the humanities, we're doing this with ourselves. It's humans who are making these judgments. For people trying to make money publishing through Facebook, they're dealing much more with algorithms. Now, there are people somewhere out there nebulously on the other end. The algorithms are choosing things that they think are going to go viral and more people are going to click on. But I think that the space of practice and of theory in the humanities is still small enough, intimate enough that we can collectively start to have these wider discussions. We don't need to, and we shouldn't be blaming some machine. It's us.
Well, and that sort of makes me think about how you open the book, or early on in the book, you talk about Ian Bogo's essay, I think it was in The Atlantic, about how algorithms or computing is a new religion, and that it takes a lot of those same principles, but now we put our faith, or a lot of us, I guess, is particularly in the West, put our faith in these algorithms and these computers that will then make us live better and fulfill us in some way. and so it's really a new religion, is the argument that he's sort of making. If you consider that, then it seems that the argument is sort of like religion was very, very powerful and then kind of lost its power. Algorithms have become increasingly powerful. I'm wondering if you think that in the future, maybe in the next couple of decades or maybe longer than that, will the idea of algorithms, the way that we think of them today, will they potentially also lose to something else or give way to something else? Or do you think that basically algorithms, at least the way that they're used, are kind of here to stay?
I don't know for sure, but my guess is that we're going to see a continuing apotheosis of the algorithm. But we're going to stop calling it an algorithm because I think that word will become less useful as we move farther into the space of machine intelligence and systems that have enough agency that we're having real conversations with them rather than having these sort of very transactional services, right, where you push a button and something happens. It's going to feel more like we're talking to an entity. And I think that religious faith is going to transfer into that, right, that new set of entities, these intelligences. There's a really interesting and controversial demo that Google did a couple of weeks ago. I think we called it Duo. Is that right? I don't know if you're familiar with this. They had a voice assistant, sort of, a Siri-like voice assistant, but the person who was using the assistant asked it to schedule a haircut, and then this system called up a human being working at a hair salon and scheduled the appointment without disclosing that it was a machine doing the talking. And Google demoed this, and then there was an immediate outcry to say, oh, this feels really disingenuous and deceptive that the system wouldn't announce itself as a machine. Mm-hmm. And that's the world we're beginning to enter into. Those are the conversations we're going to need to have, whether AI should always disclose that they are AIs, whether we're going to come up with some sort of shared understanding of different kinds of AI. Are there systems that are smarter or dumber, putting scare quotes around both of those words? Mm-hmm. And how are we going to deal with all of this on a cultural level? I think that we already have glimpses of this in the way that we engage with systems like Google and even Siri. I try to remind my students that there are things that Google doesn't know. That when you conduct a search and you get a set of results, those results are not the map, right? That's not the Borges map and territory. They don't give you everything in the world. Mm-hmm. There are things that are beyond the ken of the servers at Google. That's a very simple, obvious point, but I think it does make some of them, you can see, I've never really thought about that before.
Yeah.
It's important to make those interventions, and it will continue to be important as our relationship with computational systems becomes more and more collaborative. In some circumstances, it's going to feel like co-equals, right? To be dealing with equals rather than this sort of subservient or master-slave relationship. But we're going to be working with machines. There are going to be machine learning-based legal systems and medical systems, there already are, that are going to take over some of the more mundane tasks. But those systems are going to start to have names, and they're going to start to have personalities, and we're going to need to come to grips with that, and we're going to believe things about them because we're always looking for our reflection in our tools. We're always looking to find the spark of humanity. We're all like Victor Frankenstein, maybe Victor Frankenstein before he brings his creature to life, or maybe afterwards as well. Not sure. But we're always looking for that. And, sometimes we find it or think we find it. And that can be the beginning of this sort of the faith experience as well.
It makes me think about an experience I had where a student of mine in film class, she came to me and said that she couldn't find anything on horror films. She wanted to write an essay on horror, and there was no research done on that. I was really confused for a second, and I said, I can name 5 or 10 authors off the top of my head who have written about horror. But it turned out that what had happened is I gave, a fairly specific question that I gave out to the class about different topics they could do. And she had input the question, like a paragraph-sized question, into Google, and it gave little to no results. And so she thought that nothing had ever been written on this question because the literal question wasn't immediately answered by Google. I never would have thought that would be the case, but I don't think that this is a one-time thing. I think a number of people do think that Google has all the answers to that. which kind of brings up the more philosophical question, which is how do we live better with these technologies and these algorithms? Do you have a sense of how a regular person, somebody who doesn't necessarily study these things, what would you encourage people to do? On one level, just based on the reading of your book, I don't think that giving all of our information and all of our lives over to algorithms is the best idea. But at the same time, I don't think we can remove ourselves completely from this equation. So how do you see good shared, I guess, life experience between algorithms and humans?
One place to start is with more transparency and more clarity in the kinds of deals we're making with computational systems. So we need to understand the contracts that we're signing, not necessarily in every detail, but to understand in fundamental terms what the details of our arrangements are with systems like Google and Facebook, that we're getting these free services in exchange for our data, and that we are the products for many of these services, and they're marketing us to advertisers and others. The recent passage of the European data protection regulations is, I think, a positive sign in that regard. And I've been getting this flood of updated privacy notices from all these different companies. And I think that's really powerful. I was struck, I just heard today that apparently there are more Facebook users in the European Union than there are in the United States, which I thought was an interesting statistic and a signal of the power that more traditional players, political players, nation states still have to shape this dynamic. I think we're living through a real crisis of epistemology, the politics of knowing, and the way that we work that out. I think that's all really important as we're coming to grips with this new collective information economy. I feel like we've created this global body that has no immune system yet. And so we're incredibly vulnerable to viruses, to different kinds of infections and attacks. And you see these viruses playing themselves out in these immune system responses. We're still just beginning to come to terms with how to live together in this way. I don't really think there's any going back, or all the paths backwards seem pretty scary, and I don't think we want to live in a regime like China or Russia, where there is some version of an internet, but it's heavily manipulated and in certain ways controlled. So we need to find a way to develop that immune system, to develop healthier interactions with one another, and to come up with shared understandings, shared epistemologies. One of the more pressing challenges, I think, of the next couple of decades is to start to work that out, because especially in the United States, all of this is basically governed through contract law. It all depends on the contracts that we're signing with these companies.
In the book, you mentioned, sort of in the spirit of Raymond Williams, a few keywords that you introduce and that are really crucial to understanding, to algorithmic literacy, I guess. What keywords would you hope that people will become more familiar with, and would you encourage people to become more familiar with? Like, what key terms do you think are more important than ever, perhaps?
Algorithm is obviously one keyword, and that's sort of the question of truth and the ways in which we believe things to be true. Computation is actually a keyword that I think people should be more aware of because of its slide into computationalism and that religious faith that maybe everything is a computer, and given enough money and enough processing units, you can simulate the human brain or the stock market or the universe itself. And then I guess the keyword that I'm really interested in, where I want to go next, is imagination. How we think of our human uniqueness, our sense of identity, our sense of raison d'etre, how that changes as computers can do more and more of the stuff that we can do. I think imagination is a crucial part of that. And then finally, the keyword that everybody's already talking about, which I do think is going to be important, is intelligence, and this notion of how machines can start to become agents in the world. And maybe the flip side of that, the piece that I don't think enough people are talking about, is empathy. And I think actually empathy is the secret weapon we all need to wield to start to develop that sort of immune system and to be able to more effectively engage in digital culture, that we need to approach the other, approach differing political viewpoints, approach even really extreme perspectives with a sense of empathy and try to understand where some other human being is coming from. and to begin with the things that we have in common rather than finding the things that pull us apart. We do a number of projects with science fiction writers at the center that I run. And one of them, Carl Schroeder, has this really nice line that the internet is sort of like a giant disagreement machine for helping you find exactly how you disagree with other people, but maybe there's a better way to construct it.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think all of those would be really powerful tools. My last question, what are you most excited about that you're working on now that you hope to release in the future?
I am just starting to work on a new project on the question of imagination and thinking of it as a fundamental human capacity, something that we all have, that most of us get beaten out of us through formal education at one point or another, but that we then celebrate in later life and sort of wring our hands about it and say, well, where did it go? Why aren't people more imaginative? My contention is that imagination is not just a source, for great art, for great public engagement, for changing the world. Imagination is a deeply necessary resource for confronting all of the challenges that we face today, all of the complex, intertwined, wicked hard problems we have, that you have to begin with imagination. That's actually the only way we're going to solve these problems or struggle our way through them. And so that's what I want to write my next book about, a history and a future of the imagination.
Wow, that sounds great. I have to ask, though, can computers potentially have imagination? Maybe into the future, obviously not today, I don't think. Is there that potential for AI to develop imagination in your mind?
Well, I think that this becomes like intelligence. Alan Turing famously argued, if you want to define intelligence, just define it as a machine that can deceive you into thinking that it's intelligent. And I think imagination works sort of the same way. It's very difficult to pin down what we really mean by that. Maybe one of the better answers is surprise. Computers are pretty bad at randomness. What humans mean by surprise is not true randomness. It's something weirder than that. And so I don't know. And I suppose there's also a related question of self-awareness. There might be one thing to create a kind of muse or oracle machine that creates things that we find strikingly imaginative, but a very different thing to have an imagining machine that knows that it's imagining.
Well, I have to say, between your book and what you've said today, you give a lot of food for thought, and I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me today.
Oh, thank you. This was really fun.
As always, thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I appreciate the feedback I've gotten. If you're interested in seeing Ed's 5 recommended readings or anyone else I've interviewed, make sure to check out tinapp.org. And if you're listening on iTunes, Stitcher, any of these fine apps, please leave a review for This Is Not a Pipe podcast. That's how people get to know about it and what's out there, and I really appreciate it. Until next time.